Hello, good morning. My name is Eva Konchal, and I'm a CEE manager at EBPA, and I would like to welcome you at the third CEE webinar. Before we go into the webinar itself, few technical points on the system that we are using. You all have the panel next to at your screen where you can see the attendees. You can also put the questions in the Q&A. You all will be muted and this session is recorded. So if some of you joined late, you can always listen and watch the webinar online. All right, next one, please. So first, I want to thank all the partners that are helping us to organize this series of webinars. I want to thank Marta Lesiewska from Inspired, Staszek from Firley and Castore. We are developing the content together of those webinars, and also PSIC, the Polish Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, that is helping us to promote and disseminate the information about this webinar. So actually today's webinar is coinciding with the media protests. As some of you may have heard that we have been witnessing right now in Poland. All the mainstream independent private media actually stopped broadcasting for 24 hours as a response to government's proposal to introduce a tax on revenues coming from advertising for the media outlets. And obviously the argumentation of the state authorities is that this is a finance-focused reason because we need more money in our budget. However, we believe that actually we are following the footsteps of, let's say, countries like Hungary, where actually initiatives like that were actually another step towards elimination of free and independent media, which we believe are really critical in providing reliable and fact-based information. So I'm actually sure that today's conversation, Marta's introductions, and our speakers will address some of those challenges that independent media, but also entities like Echovadis, for example, or Responsible Investor, are trying to face when it comes to either a pressure or regulations that are coming from different stakeholders that we are trying to engage with. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. Thank you, big thank you to our guest speakers who joined us today. And Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva, for this introduction. I will set the stage a little bit because without a doubt we have this webinar in a particular moment we are facing in Poland, and in general the heated political debate about media in CEE region, because it's not only the case in Poland, it's also the case in Hungary, in other countries. We can see the pressure now in India regarding the governmental pressure on Twitter to stop, to block the accounts of people who are engaged in the agricultural protest. We can see the big discussion in Australia that is going on. So we can all see that this is a proof like how significant is the role media play in a public discussion and in creating the public awareness. And the discussion can go about the role of the media in the world in the various directions. May I ask for the next slide, please? So basically with the digital transformation we are witnessing, everyone can be a media maker approach. It creates an endless number of related issues. It's about ethics, values, freedom of speech, fact checking, journalism codes, standards, fake news, sources of changing business model and media consumption models. But today we want to take into account those aspects that are really important for in the context of investing for impact series. So we want to focus on the influence media have to drive the change towards stakeholders capitalism. We will look for an answer on how the media can cover and covers environmental, social, and government aspects of of corporates and investing institutions, how this influenced firms, regulators, and standard-setting boards. If you take any book about corporate responsibility, mostly written by authors who operate in developed countries of Western Europe or United States, you likely find arguments about why companies should implement sustainability strategies. One of the key ideas is the reputation and managing the positive or negative media coverage and managing the risk of negative media coverage. However, and this is from my personal experience and from, I think, experience of many other sustainability consultants, if you try to present those arguments to the board members across the CE region, you will probably fail to convince them. And data presented on this slide shows a trend. We can easily assume that the UK is representative for Western countries and Poland for the CE region. The motivation behind companies' engagement in environmental and social issues differs a lot between those two. In the UK survey, sustainability managers mentioned employees, customers, shareholders, investors. 51 mentioned actually media as a driver towards more sustainable strategies, and 37% EU regulations. Obviously, it was before the Brexit. On the right side, we have typical CE declarations. So motivation here seems to also come from the employees, however, in definitely smaller numbers than in the UK. It's important they are mentioning the pressure coming from global corporations, from the EU regulations, customers, and NGOs. Media are not even present in this setting. So we can see how the strategy of carrots and sticks influence both types of markets. And if we look at those numbers, the red flag appeared really a little later, few pages later on the report from Poland. 50% of surveyed CSR managers mentioned lack of sustainability and CSR related coverage in the media as a challenge they are facing when convincing their top management. So we encountered this challenge by talking to journalists in the region and inviting them to the journalists, to be honest. What we heard was, but we are not covering the CSR. Oh, please contact the advertising office. They are taking care of those issues. And we heard those phrases a lot. So really today we hope we can inspire regional media with the case studies and stories that will be presented by all great guests that we have, and that you are all, Anna, Sylvain, Hag, you are presenting completely different kinds of media, different kinds of ecosystem actually players, as Sylvain represents Echovadis, is a rating agency which using the media coverage. So I really hope that we can give a lot of tips and practical stories to see how media can deal and enhance this stakeholders' capitalism and fuel the transition into more green and sustainable business models and economy. So first, please, the next slide, and I will set a little stage for today's discussion. The short and brief introduction. Basically, for everyone to be on the same page among our viewers and listeners. Basically, in capitalism and democratic countries, the discussion about the role business could and should play in society has been debated for years. The concept evolved from business ethics and philanthropy at the beginning of the 20th century. Still popular today, corporate social responsibility, CSR concept, was developed in the 60s. Then we moved to shareholder value, the triple bottom line in the late 90s, to the current ideas of regenerative value and stakeholders capitalism that bloomed really 2-3 years ago. So we went from supporting communities through sponsorships to doing business by creating value for all stakeholders and contributing to natural resources restoration. And can I have a next slide, please? And the finance sector really followed the business principle changes. This slide is a leitmotif of our webinar series and presents the evolution and different forms of how financial sector supports business through investing strategies. And from traditional investing through responsible, sustainable, thematic, and impact investing in the blend form and impact first in investment strategies, our finance sector is engaging within the business. We cover those in details during the first webinar, so it's still accessible online, so you can join and watch this in details if you are interested to dive deeper into this topic. But what I really want to highlight here is that the development and popularization of those forms in recent years is strongly connected in the developed countries with the education of the assets manager and setting ESG topics high on the business media agenda. And for sure, media are not the only catalyst of the change. However, the impact of investigating journalism techniques that applied to the reports about companies' environmental practices, their approach to health and safety of the employees, use of natural resources, but also about the added value for local communities, plays an important role also in those popularization of those financing strategies. However, it's not the case of the academic discussion. Next slide, please. And it's also reflected in many numbers that we'll jump in a second, but also stakeholders. The idea that shareholders' profit can be generated at the expense of stakeholders now is the main idea behind the stakeholders' capitalism. If we look at the media events that underpin those evolutions, we ought to name Larry Fink from BlackRock list to CEOs from 2016, then new level of discussion in Davos about sustainable development in 2020, Business Roundtable, a release of the statement on the purpose of corporation, signed by 181 CEOs last year. And media played a significant role in passing those messages. How important is the part independent news coverage and media freedom highlights even the last letter of Matthias Döpfner, CEO of Axel Springer, to Ursula von der Leyen, where he calls for more restrictive regulation in the EU to protect values and data privacy against global digital corporations' misuse. So we are seeing all this revolution going on, and we can see it also in the numbers and the flow, the financial flows into the companies from the financial sector. And it should be on the next slide, I assume. So we can see that the ecosystem is changing, and we can see the confirmation also in the numbers. So it's not only about the discussion in media or the discussion we have around the coffee tables. Sustainable investments grew by 74% between 2014 and 2018. The impact investing growth is even more impressive because it's almost above 700%. However, as we discussed in our first webinars of the series, those numbers are less representative for the CEE region. The number of sustainable investments is small enough to remain unknown here. This evolution would take probably longer without media help and media support in the developed countries. And as on the next slide, we can see some of the examples just of the media pressure, the very significant media pressure that we observed in the recent years. And really, journalists guided by their instinct, ethics, principles, presented the stories to the world about the corporates' actions that were hidden behind glossy CSR reports. Let me just mention in the environmental context the Volkswagen emission scandal, the Cancer Town story, the climate protests that were led by Greta Thunberg. In terms of social impact of the firms, breaching the labor law in China by Apple subcontractor in 2010 that led to suicide among the employees, or last year a Boohoo scandal, in UK-based company, the factory scandal that was taking place in the UK factory. So it's not only developing on emerging markets problem. And the latter, the Boohoo scandal, led to 15% drop in the company valuation. Also in terms of G, so the governance, the story behind the success of Theranos was also exposed by journalists awarded by Pulitzer Prize. So without those mentioned and thousands of other stories, the shift we observe today would take longer. And we strongly believe that media are play a very important role to make this transition faster. And if we observe, then if we would take the innovation adaptation curve, the sustainability related topics in the media now moved from innovators, scientific journals, and advanced management magazines. Slowly, they're going to the mainstream. We can observe, may I have a next slide, please? We can observe now increasing number of specialized media outlets. Today, we have editors from Responsible Investors and from Pioneers Post. And we can observe those in both in developed and emerging markets. We also can see that mainstream business and general interest media in Western Europe and in the United States also are more likely to cover topics like climate change, companies' commitments, and greenwashing practices, social enterprises, and sustainability-driven innovations than the one in the CEE region. The top stories influence shifts basically in public opinions, public policy, corporate behaviors. And this was shown also on the examples of the stories I mentioned before, but there are hundreds of other stories that are run every day that we are actually feel a little bit missing in the CEE region. So in 2019 and 2020, top stories included climate protests, corporate commitments, greenwashing practices, changing regulations and social environmental innovations, but also COVID-19 impact on sustainability. So if we are looking overall on the media coverage, we can see like 5 different roles the media play in this coverage. So it's questioning, it's campaigning, it's inspiring, also implying, but also normalizing a lot of issues and make public opinion more familiar with them. So, and today I would like to discuss with our guests also those type of coverage and how it influences the decisions and whole ecosystem of changing into more sustainable business model with my guests. So we are joined today by Hag Whelan, the founder and the managing director for Responsible Investor. We can't see you, but I believe we can hear you.
You can, Marta, hopefully.
Right. Hopefully, yes, we do. We do.
Nice to be here, and sorry I can't be there on screen. It's probably a good thing because lockdown doesn't do a lot for for managing to still look good. It's nice to see that Sylvain and Anna have managed to circumvene that and are looking good. It's nice to be here on the webinar with them on a subject that is obviously close to all of our hearts.
Thank you. So we are also joined by Anna Patton, the editor of Pioneers Post, and by Sylvain Gouillon, the vice president of Echovadis, a rating agency that uses media coverage to support ESG rating of the companies. So we have three completely different perspectives, and before we go to more extended discussion, and I will let them to present their stories and their businesses and their perspective. So Hag, maybe let me start with you. If you could just add a few words about responsible investors.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for teeing up the slide. So, Marta, the way you pronounce my name is much nicer than the way it gets pronounced over here. So my name is Hugh Whelan, but it's okay. Hug sounds much better, certainly this morning. But yeah, I'm the co-founder, one of the two co-founders of Responsible Investor, which we started just over 13 years ago. And in terms of myself, I've been a finance journalist for 25 plus years, working for a number of newspapers. I guess in the mainstream press, having written for the Guardian, Financial Times, and others. Spent a long time as a finance journalist writing for pretty straightforward mainstream financial newspapers. And when we started Responsible Investor back in 2006, our aim was to take our beliefs and interests in sustainability into the financial markets, where we believed and still do believe that the ability to direct change lies both in terms of the way that finance operates and the way that finance influences corporations. That's still the case. I mean, on this slide, you can see who our readers are, which I guess is of interest here. So we have a membership of 30,000 plus readers and members globally. At the moment, split quite evenly between EMEA, so European, mostly European readership, and the Americas, with a growing Asian readership. And I won't run through the breakdown of stats there, but broadly, financial institutions, asset owners, investment consultants, and all the service providers and companies in that ecosystem of the financial markets. We really started, as I mentioned, to take sustainability issues that were becoming increasingly important societally, but also becoming increasingly important financially, and to filter those through the lens of financial decision making and corporate and business decision making, because our feeling was that that wasn't the way that these issues were being considered and reported on. And we also have a pretty clear aim in what we want to do. We want to lead strategic, sustainable change in financial markets. And by financial markets, I mean all of the chain of financial markets, including corporations. And we want to do that through thought leadership, proprietary journalism. I think that's important. We want to do real journalism. There's a lot of unreal journalism out there. And we want to build communities of business and finance professionals to do that. And that's really what we still do today, 13 years later. We have a global readership of people in the business and finance worlds. We aim to produce the best possible journalism we can, the best possible events that we can, the best possible workshops and gatherings that we can. And we aim to really talk about what is relevant in terms of actually doing business and looking at that through the huge sustainability challenges that we all face right now, whether it's climate change, biodiversity, human rights issues, we don't need to go through all of the topics that we write about, but you know, we've got a great team, really dedicated team doing that job day in and day out. Maybe I'll leave it there. I don't want to carry on for too long, but happy to answer any questions or get into discussions with Anna and Sylvain.
We will definitely go more into details, and we will ask you definitely more questions about also how the content has changed over the years, and how your audience has changed over the years, because like 2016 is like 14 years, and there were a lot of changes on the market going on. But now I will also let Anna introduce the Pioneer Pros that was created quite about the same period, right? And the same, like, I think similar motivations and ideas behind a similar time, however, completely different audience. So please, Anna, if you could share a few words about the Pioneers Post, it would be great.
Yes, great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, and thanks a lot for having us here today. Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about Pioneers Post. As you said, quite different, but also, I mean, some similarities with Responsible Investor. We were created in the early 2000s. Before my time, I joined about 2.5 years ago. We were set up and we consider ourselves the independent news network for the global impact community. And by impact community, we mean generally social entrepreneurs, impact investors, and mission-driven business leaders around the world. So people running businesses that are aiming to do more than just make someone a lot of money. Yeah, if you want to carry on. You don't need to read all of this, but just to kind of point out that our vision, I suppose we see ourselves very much as part of this impact economy, and we see our role as helping to grow it, because we believe that it will sort of fundamentally improve the world for everyone. And the way that we kind of contribute to that, or hope to contribute to that, is through good journalism. And I liked what Hugh said earlier about real journalism. There is a lot of content out there that is yeah, that is not journalism, and we as journalists have kind of an important role to kind of really sort of add to that, and add real sort of journalistic integrity and sort of more in-depth research to what's going on. Yeah, next slide, please. So just briefly what we do, and this might be interesting to those of you running media companies in other countries as well. So we obviously have our website with all the usual kind of articles and podcasts and newsletter and things like that. We do awards. So we do some really nice projects in partnership with a bank here in the UK, which is to recognise the top 100 social enterprises in the UK, and also the top 100 women in social enterprise in the country. And we've been doing those for the last number of years, and it's sort of a really nice kind of community building exercise, I suppose, and also just is a nice way to kind of throw the spotlight on some really interesting and really yeah, pioneering people in this field. We do some events. We also do some training and mentoring. So the group you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there of very excited looking young people is 14 young journalists that we worked with over the course of about 1.5 years. This was a partnership with the British Council, so we recruited them, we gave them some training, and then we sent them back to their countries, and then we worked with them over the course of the year to kind of mentor them, to help them to produce stories about creative and social enterprise in their countries, which we then published on Pioneers Post. So it kind of is a really nice project in terms of building capacity of journalists in other countries, us getting access to some really interesting, unusual stories in places where we didn't have people on the ground, and also helping the British Council to meet its kind of goals of giving more exposure to some of the projects that they are involved in. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, just publish all the sort of many of the usual things that you'd expect. We have what we call our impact library, just in the bottom right-hand corner there, which is, so we have most of our content, or a lot of our content, is open access. but we keep some of it behind a paywall, which is then accessible to our paying subscribers. So that's an important part of our business model. Yeah, and then if you just click through this one, yeah, thank you. So our readers sort of not totally different to Responsible Investor. There is probably a little bit of overlap in that we will cover things like family offices, some of the kind of asset owners in that sense, but there's much more of a we try to look at the impact economy as a whole, and we have a big emphasis on the social entrepreneurs themselves and the people running the business themselves. We were actually, when we were founded in the early 2000s, it was initially called Social Enterprise Magazine. And then at some point, some years ago, it was rebranded to become Pioneers Post, partly in recognition that I suppose the impact economy is made up of much more than just what we might narrowly consider social enterprises. So we kind of consider all of these different types of audiences in our work. Yeah, just to this, you can maybe pass through that. We have a growing number of website visitors every year. So we are really seeing quite a big increase in interest in the past couple of years, and there definitely feels like there's scope to do a lot more in this area. And just briefly to say that we've set ourselves up as a social enterprise ourselves. So we are a community interest company, which is a particular legal form created in the UK specifically for social enterprises. It's sort of a legal structure that's a little bit in between a charity and a company. It means that all our profits have to go back to support our social mission, which is, as I said, to kind of support this growing ecosystem of impact economy players. Yeah, if you carry on to the next slide, thanks. Just briefly, I think we can talk about this a little bit later if that's useful, but just to kind of highlight how our business works, which is something that every media business in the world is scratching their head over. So we have a mix of subscriptions, paying subscribers, but also content partnerships. So I've mentioned British Council, a really important one, NatWest, the bank that we work with on the awards schemes and other things, and of course EBPA as well. We do some events, we do some training, and we also have we work alongside a creative comms agency, so that allows us to share some common resources. And just briefly to mention our ongoing partnership with EBPA, which again I can talk about in a bit more detail later if that's useful, but that involves a whole range of things. We have a special kind of section on the website that we designed with the EBPA and the number of stories that get published in that collection throughout the year. We've done sort of event coverage and sent out special newsletters from the EBPA annual conference, and have produced kind of special digital multimedia magazines. So that just gives you an idea of the kinds of things that you can do within a content partnership. But yeah, I'll stop there and I can tell you more about any of those things later if that's useful.
Yes, we will definitely dive deeper into the questions about the solutions journalism that you mentioned, and the impact commitment that you have behind, and the real journalism that you both actually mentioned, the difference between unreal and real journalism, and definitely we will go deeper in the next few minutes. Also, before I will jump with a lot of questions to all of you, just kindly reminder that on the chat also all our viewers can prepare and write questions to you, and we will manage them in the end of the webinar. But now I would like to also give five minutes or a few more to Sylvain, who is Vice President of Echovadis. And Echovadis builds their ESG and the company's ratings by gathering a lot of information from different sources. One of them are also media coverage. So definitely later I would like to discuss how you catch the difference between unreal and real journalism because it's important. But also you are actually using the coverage and the content that is published by outlets such as Responsible Investor and Pioneers Post as well. So could you please tell a little bit to our viewers about Echovadis and how it works, about what do you do?
Yes, thanks, Marta. Thank you again for inviting us into this webinar. And to echo what Hugh and Anna said about real journalism, I can't agree more. Indeed, we need more real journalists more than ever in this post-truth era in stakeholder capitalism. And I think the other day I was really happy because my son, who is 15, told me he wanted to become a journalist. So I told him that's a wonderful activity. Not sure he will be able to make a living, but you know, we have to work hard to support this. We are also at Echovadis, you know, passionate readers of Responsible Investors. We've seen the content increasing a lot and very good quality. So we read it. I read it daily almost. So congrats. So a little word about Echovadis. We are indeed ESG rating agency or CSR rating agency or sustainability rating agency. The terms varies according to our audience. It's also a word of terms, and it's not really standardized. But anyway, we are ESG rater. We work on behalf of about 600 big multinationals. And in particular their buying organizations, and on their behalf we rate their suppliers in supply chains. We have rated about 75,000 suppliers, which is a lot, but on one hand, but on the other hand, if we look at supply chains of the Fortune 500 companies, we estimate that there is about 2 million companies in supply chains if we want to have a significant impact. So we still have a lot of room to grow and to improve. 600 multinationals. We also start working with private equity funds because they have a similar use case than buying organizations. 75,000 suppliers, and we are now, in fact, 750 people in 13 offices, and then we have a big team in Warsaw, by the way, really great team in Warsaw. So in the next slide, just to give you a very quick glimpse on our impact model. Basically, we use the lever of buying organizations or private equity funds, which we call the requesting companies, to engage suppliers or portfolio companies, which we call the rated companies. And by rating those companies and giving them a third-party opinion on the quality of their sustainability performance, we hope that they will improve, and ultimately it will create positive impact for planet and society. So we have published, next slide, thank you. We have published our first impact report last year, and we estimate that in fact we screen about $1.4 trillion of spent through the Echovadis rating. And if you click once, you will see that this represents about 32 million workers on which we have a chance through our rating to influence positively their working conditions. And if you go to the next slide to finish the presentation on quickly on Echovadis, and before we get into the discussion, these are the topics we take into account in our rating. So we have 21 CSR criteria: environment, labor and human rights, ethics, sustainable procurement. We don't, of course, we don't activate those 21 criteria for all industry sectors. We do, we customize by industry sectors, and we keep only what we think is impactful and material. But these are the topics that we cover, so it's fairly large and wide. So we try to do like a kind of aggregate rating on all those topics. And in the next slide, in addition to the topic that we cover, these are the input that we use to actually rate the companies. So of course we use the supporting document from the companies. So we don't take for granted their declarations. For every declaration they do, we ask them supporting documents. We also look at audit reports, labels, certifications, so what the input from third-party professionals. And we also look, very importantly, at the opinion of stakeholders, because basically what we rate is the sustainability performance and the quality of their management system, which role is to mitigate negative impact on stakeholders. So the least we can do if we want to evaluate the efficiency of their management system is to ask the opinion of stakeholders. Stakeholders being NGOs, trade unions, judicial authorities, government, international organizations, and last but not the least, press and media. So I think this is an important part of our rating model, and I think in the discussion we will go into further details on how we integrate the opinion of those stakeholders, and in particular the press. Thank you.
Yes, definitely, because I think it's very this aspect is very important for our viewers, and we will touch on it and come back to this and come back to you in shortly. Now I would like to start with you and ask about you actually mentioned that Responsible Investor was established in 2016, and I'm curious to hear how the content has changed over the years, how your audience requirements and the interest evolve over the last 14 years, because you can, for this time, 15 years, so you can actually see the differences and the evolution that we mentioned before in the shift from CSR to stakeholders, capitalism to regenerative value, all those ESG explosion almost in the last 2-3 years on the market. What kind of changes have you seen? How content has changed over the years? How the sources of content has changed over the years?
Yeah, so maybe just to start on the audience. So I think the big change has been that the readership of Responsible Investor has gone from what I would describe as a traditional responsible investor audience, which was mostly people who came out of the socially responsible investment movement from the 80s and who were involved either at pension funds, asset managers, consultants, companies in looking at sustainable finance. But it was a fairly niche pursuit. I say niche in the sense that there were plenty of readers out there for a publication like ours, and we were writing specifically about them and that market. The growth in the audience and the readership has been huge in the last few years as sustainability has become a much more important and relevant topic to the whole corporate and financial world. It's always a bit glib using terms like sustainability and not really explaining them, but for the purposes of this audience, all of the things that we were writing about for socially responsible investors have all become both important to regulators in terms of starting to put in rules around things like, of course, climate change, which we see huge shifts in regulations. So everyone knows that, you know, we need to radically lower CO2 emissions. But what does that mean in terms of policy response? What does that mean in terms of the way consumers behave? What does that mean in terms of the way companies and investors then respond to those two big trends? You know, and in simple terms, we kind of look at it as a bit of a concertina. So you have finance and business in the middle, and then you have regulation and consumer trends at either end. And the context around that, of course, is the world we live in. So, you know, the sustainability of the world we live in. And in essence, the growth in readership has just reflected how all of these issues have become much more significant and important in terms of their relevance to business strategy and financial results, financial performance, financial risk. And that's the way we tend to look at the world. You know, we're pretty big picture, and you know, Anna and Pioneer Post do a fabulous job in parts of the areas we cover, but specializing a lot in the impact part, which is fabulous. We tend to be a bit more broad brush. We do impact, but we try and really sort of get our arms around what sustainability means for business and finance writ large. In terms of the content, it's sort of been more of the same, really, and a lot more of the same. So we've expanded the journalist team a hell of a lot, you know, to cover the kinds of issues that Sylvain was talking about, which have just become a lot more complicated, a lot more complex, a lot more relevant, a lot harder to report on as they become more complex, important, and relevant. And, you know, broadly, we're seeing an internationalization of sustainability and sustainable finance. So I would still argue that Europe tends to be thinking about these issues more, depending on where you are in Europe, of course, some parts of Europe more than others. And then the US looks at the same issues through a slightly different lens. And increasingly, we're starting to see Asia, and again, you get a bit broad brush here, but Asia looking at these issues through different lenses as well. Vast difference between, of course, Japan and China. And we're just seeing, you know, the same issues being amplified massively and looked at in different ways geographically. So that's kind of how our audience and content has changed over the years. I feel it's sort of better to explain it broad brush rather than get into the detail, because, you know, it's just been a lot more of the same, really. We're not doing a huge amount differently than we did when we started, just better, I would argue. And, you know, we need to get better and better, because, you know, these subjects are complicated, they're controversial, there's a lot of money involved in them. You know, they are difficult subjects to deal with. So, you know, it's you need to be producing, just in terms of the journalism we were talking about earlier, you need to be backing and producing good quality journalists. It's great to see the Pioneers Post initiative there in bringing on young journalists, because of course, you know, that's what's required. I'll shut up now.
And you actually mentioned, first of all, the complexity you are dealing with for now of the issues. But also you mentioned the different perspectives and also the pressures, the big money involved, complex issues. How do you deal with it? How do you prepare your journalists to deal with it, to report those stories, to make sure that you are really delivering the high quality journalism to your audience? Because it gets complicated. Like you have companies that advertise, you have pressure from the companies that you are reporting on, you have different points of view on the same issue in the even same company that is global. How do you work with your team to address those problems?
I'll take the second part first. So first of all, we don't worry about any pressure from advertising. We don't worry about any commercial pressure in the journalism we do. We do really what journalism should always be doing, which is to be informing people, or in some ways to be telling the world things that some people in the world don't want to be told. So, you know, if you're really defining journalism, for me, it's often what people don't want to read about themselves if they've been doing something that they shouldn't have been. So, you know, you have to be committed to going out and finding stories about things that you believe, you know, are against values that are broadly held across society. You know, I mean, in terms of doing, I suppose in a sense, you know, it's what I've always done in journalism, and I think applying it to sustainability doesn't really change, you know. But you know, I think journalism has changed, so it's become much harder to do journalism because the pressures on journalism commercially are different, and I think generally people have sort of views have shifted on what journalism is and what it represents. And I think people coming into the trade of journalism, they maybe have a tough time realizing that journalism is not public relations. You know, so you don't often have a very good relationship with people, particularly people that you've written bad things about. So you have to be pretty tough about the way you deal with things. And you know, it's just become harder and harder to do good journalism. There are vastly more public relations people out there than there are journalism. In fact, many of them used to be good friends of mine. Some of them still are. But you know, there's a lot of people out there who are involved in marketing for corporations, you know, broadly. So, you know, you have to deal with that, you know, and they want you to write about them. And you might not want to write about that, but you still have to take a lot of time in dealing with what that means. So, you know, again, I'll stop there, but that's, you know, that's how we deal with it, you know. Just maybe one last point, you know, our feeling is that of all of the business we do around responsible investors, so we do, you know, similar to what Anna had put forward earlier, you know, events, we do, you know, all sorts of commercial things that enable us to do journalism. We also get people to pay for our journalism, which is really important. And you know, we like to put our imprimatur of quality on all of those things. So whatever we do it with the same principles involved. You know, we want to be thought leaders, courageous thinkers leading discussion, not kind of talking about issues that are not important or pretending that you know, certain things are true when they're not. You know, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks. And Anna, like you also, I think, share a lot of the same in very similar principles in terms of the Pioneers Post, and also Pioneers Post represents not only this approach to read the things that are uncomfortable to read, but also to promote the solutions to the things that are uncomfortable, and there are some kind of challenges. So we are promoting a lot of solutions journalism. So could you please tell more about the concept, but also share maybe the story that maybe from your experience, like how this coverage and covering social enterprises, community-based solutions works, and what kind of principles and guiding principles for journalists do you have in promoting the solutions journalism?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, similar to Hugh, what you were saying, our role is to kind of be that accountability and digging into some kind of uncomfortable things that are going on, and that's always going to be part of journalism. But another aspect, and it does overlap a bit, but another aspect that we look at a lot is solutions journalism, and I'll just explain a little bit what that is, because some people have not come across this before. Basically, solutions journalism is defined as rigorous reporting on responses to social problems based on evidence and with a really strong emphasis on the how. So it's not just, here's a good news story, here's someone who has, I don't know, handed out food packages to their whole street, and aren't they wonderful, and isn't that a lovely story that makes you feel better at the end of the day. It's not about that one person as a hero, it's about So what is the problem they're trying to solve? How did they go about solving it? What limitations are there to this solution? Because no solution is 100% perfect, otherwise we wouldn't have the problems that we do. Every kind of effort to solve something is going to meet some bumps in the road. How have they overcome that? What have they learned along the way that others could replicate in other parts of the world? That's another really important aspect of solutions journalism. If you are interested in more of this, you can look up something called the Solutions Journalism Network, a nonprofit in the US, which is doing a lot of training and sort of promotion of this approach. And it is an approach that mainstream media are looking at. So you'll see solutions journalism in the likes of the BBC World Service, the New York Times, the Guardian, Forbes, as well as organizations like ours. The reason why we do it, and I sort of liked it and was a fan of it and was doing it before I came to Pioneers Post, but it's particularly relevant to what we do at Pioneers Post because social entrepreneurs by their nature are people who are out there trying to solve a really difficult problem, and often they're coming at it from a slightly different angle or with a kind of unusual approach. And so it lends itself really well to this type of journalism. And it fits obviously with our mission, because our mission is to kind of grow this overall impact economy. And if we can, and I didn't mention before, but although we're mainly UK based, we do sort of cover social impact stories all around the world. So one thing that we feel that we can do is to cover a solution in, I don't know, Indonesia that may well be relevant to people in South America or whatever. And by doing that really detailed reporting, asking a lot of questions to the point where your interviewee kind of thinks, okay, you're getting a bit too detailed here, but going that bit further and sort of finding out like why did that happen, how did that happen, who else is doing that, could this work elsewhere? Those are the kinds of things that can potentially be really useful to someone else working in another country. And just to add, there is a bit of accountability on that, because you can talk about, say, a massive social problem in one part of the world, and you can just say, well, the government, it's just, they can't do anything about it because it's just inevitable, it's a huge problem. If you can do solutions journalism showing that this problem has been successfully tackled or solved in another part of the world, that sends a very clear message to whoever's running that country or region that it's not inevitable and there are ways to solve it. So I think it's a really effective way to kind of I suppose to use journalism in a more proactive sort of solutions focused way, sort of more positive approach to journalism. And there's evidence that that readers do engage with it more. They want to come back to outlets that do this type of journalism. A lot of people are really just switching off from the news when it's entirely negative. They just think they've heard it all before. There's no point in reading it again. It's too depressing. Whereas if you can kind of show something in this more positive, constructive, but still rigorous and still evidence-based light, then that can have positive effects for your readership.
Mm-hmm. It's very important what you mentioned. So the positive and the negative stories, the outcomes, but also also you mentioned a lot of complexity about the news coverage and how those issues that you are covering are complex, and there is not a lot of easy stories. So now I would like to also ask Sylvain about how ratings like yours are dealing with this complexity. How you are able to, and are you able to discover and to have a difference, catch the difference between the PR releases that were mentioned by Hugh and Anna before, and unreal journalism, and the real journalism that is covering the companies? Are you taking into account only positive or also the negative coverage about the companies? How it works? Our microphone. Yes.
No, very good question. So, as I said, media coverage and press is part of our 360 360 indicator. So we have documents from companies, we have third-party professionals, and then we have opinion of stakeholders through the 360. It's important to understand that stakeholder, we're looking at the opinion of stakeholders, meaning the representative of stakeholders. So employees mean trade unions. Environment cannot talk, so we get its opinion or her opinion, I don't know, through NGOs. Judicial authorities represent civil society, and then you have the press, and it's very important. And in this 360, it's important for us also to qualify the sources and to qualify the stakeholders, because some stakeholders, supposedly stakeholders, are not legitimate and others are legitimate. So for instance, when we collect data or information or news from the press, we qualify the press source. Not all media or newspapers or online magazines are qualified, are legitimate stakeholders for us, first of all. Then when we think they are legitimate sources, then we look at the news that they publish. And indeed, in the news, mostly they are negative, or they are challenging what the companies are saying or telling in their documents. And that's exactly what we want. We want to have a contradictory debate, because if the opinions are not, the stakeholders are not expressing their opinions, and the press in particular, then the only input we have to rate the company is the voice and the documents of the company itself. So it's very important that the stakeholders and the press express themselves. So we look at those news. So in most cases, they are negative, or I should say challenging. And we try to see if they are well documented, if they are based on facts, if they have themselves done a contradictory kind of research to publish their paper. So we're looking at whether it's good journalism and whether we can take with a high level of insurance the facts, the news, or the cases that are exposing. And if it's the case, we will impact the rating, and based on the severity of the case, it can go up to 21 points out of 100. So why 21 points? Because there are other aspects in the rating, and so we try to find a balance. Companies are saying 21 points, it's too much. NGOs, trade unions, and the press are saying it's not enough. So probably we found the right balance. But and one criticism we have is that if there is a severe case and the company lose 21 points, it can compensate by other actions. That's true, but we also have in the rating some discriminatory cases. So it means even if they can reach a higher score by compensating a negative case, if the case is severe enough, this will bar them to reach a certain threshold. So we have this mechanism to make sure that they are not going to compensate negative news by some other actions. To answer your question on PR or not, how to distinguish and how to not credit what is in fact PR. But first of all, that's our job. We have lots of analysts. We have in the team, we have about 200 analysts, 15 in Warsaw, by the way. And as I said, first of all, the approach is based on qualifying the source, very important. So once the source has been qualified, then at least we have a first level of assurance. And then we look at we have eligibility criteria and quality criteria in the article. And in fact, it's quite easy to detect PR, to tell you the truth. I mean, there are gray areas, especially in specialized press, because the specialized press for certain magazine, the business model is based upon paid content pushed by companies themselves. but it's quite easy to detect. And in fact, we have implemented internally AI layer, so artificial intelligence. Sorry to pronounce this big word, this buzzword, but in fact, we have searched and qualified or disqualified hundreds of thousands and even millions of articles in the past 12 years. And what we've done 2 years ago, we took this data, which was manually qualified for 12 years by human beings. We put it into a machine, and the machine now is able to tell us whether the article is acceptable or not with 95% confidence. And of course, there is an analyst behind who will confirm or not. So the machine is even learning, as we speak, and therefore I think we're becoming better at detecting those PR content. We will never replace entirely the analyst by a machine, but we want to support the analyst with the artificial intelligence, and that's an example of how the technology can be used as a force for good, in a sense. Does it answer your questions?
Yes, in a very comprehensive way. But it's very important. I think you almost like we touched so many different the stories and the aspects of the job that you are doing, and the business models and the approach. How do you use the journalism? How do you make the journalism? How the content is produced? But also, I would like to have like 2 final questions, because we were running a little bit out of time in this interesting discussion about, like, you observe this change over the years, all of you in like 15, 16, 17 years, and also the type of the coverage, quality of the coverage, but also the increasing numbers of the coverage regarding the sustainability issues. And this is something that we are not really observing in the CEE region, like that the media are not covering independently a lot of companies. They're actually following, as we heard before, and when we were inviting a lot of journalists to this webinars, like that this is the advertising office matter, and please contact, they will prepare some research report about how the responsible business is dealing with this kind of issues. So please go to the advertising office. So have you observed this kind of evolution also in the France, in the UK, on other markets, that there was a change and there was a popularization of the topic, and the quality came with the time? How it was developed over the years? Or you didn't have to deal with this kind of problems that we are dealing in the CE region?
Shall I just jump in first, Marta? Yeah. I've seen that same situation in every market that I've ever written about. For a significant portion of actors, whether it be business or finance in those countries, there's been resistance to the idea that sustainability is important, relevant, and integral to the way that businesses and finance act. And I've also seen the shift occur in all of those same countries as business and finance realizes that all of these issues are increasingly relevant to the way they operate. And just to give you maybe one very clear example of how I think the Central and Eastern European countries are going to come under increasing scrutiny in the next couple of years on the issue of climate change. The European Union Sustainable Finance Action Plan applies to all of those countries. It's looking at putting a taxonomy in on what should be financed as green. That will have a huge impact on the scrutiny of companies and their environmental policies in Central and Eastern Europe. There's a lot of resistance to that at the lobbying level, but you either believe in the science that is out there and the empirical evidence that things need to change and they will change, and that policy and consumer behavior will drive that, or you'll potentially be out of business in 10 years' time. So in my experience, business and finance starts to understand that question much more clearly when they realize that it's potentially an existential threat to whether they stay in business, and whether corporate and finance decisions start to revolve around it. And you are going to see that enormously in Central and Eastern Europe in the next few years.
So coming back to the first slide, carrots and sticks, definitely sticks. We can
I'm a bit more of a stick kind of journalism. I love what Anna put forward earlier about the Solutions Journalism Network. I support that wholeheartedly, but I tend to be a bit more of a traditionalist sort of stick kind of reporter, because I think the issues are so important and the relevance is so I think vital to the way that businesses and companies across the whole world and across all sectors have to respond. You know, I love the kind of work of impact finance and social entrepreneurship. It's hugely important, but to make the big changes that are required, we need social entrepreneurship to be all entrepreneurship in a sense, you know, or at least responsive to what society requires. And if you were just looking at climate change, it requires vast cuts in CO2 emissions over a relatively short time frame. And you're going to see regulation and consumer shifts happen there at a lightning speed. People used to say this kind of thing would take decades until you saw the share prices of companies in the renewable energy space, and let's face it, in the renewables vehicle space. Now, whether Tesla's share price is justified or not is a moot point, but it is a huge share price now. And I remember when people used to talk about Tesla as if it was a green environmental stock. You know, things change really quickly. You know, they don't change, and then suddenly they do. And people need to be, investors and companies need to be looking at these shifts now, because they are hugely relevant to the bottom line for them. And let's be honest, most companies and investors look at their bottom line first before they look at what they can do for society. I might not necessarily see things that way, but that is the reality of what happens in business and capital markets. But these issues are hugely relevant now to what the way they go about doing their business.
And Anna, what is your perspective? Thank you, Hugh. Like Anna, what is your perspective on the issue, on the maturity of the topic and in the journalism community?
Well, I mean, I can't talk to I haven't been covering this topic for as long as Hugh, so I can't give such a long perspective, but I kind of think that it does feel like nowadays, if you are a media outlet covering business and finance and you're not talking about these topics, then you're really missing a big part of the story. And even just on a personal level, when I started at Pioneers Post a few years ago, compared to now, when I think about sort of family and friends who work in mainstream finance, private equity business and stuff, I feel like now they're kind of interested in what I'm doing and what I'm talking about. I do feel like things have changed and things have moved on. And when it comes to social enterprise, particularly, in some ways, the UK was one of the strongest places to get that going, sort of 15, 20 years ago. But that's changed, and we're seeing a lot of really interesting moves to promote social entrepreneurship in other countries, where governments are kind of putting in place social enterprise support policies, and they see social entrepreneurship as a way to help them to reach, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, or to reach particular sort of economic goals within their country, inclusive economic goals within their country. And that's happening in sort of in pockets all around the world with the support of organizations like, like the British Council, or say AVPN or EVPA, all these kind of networks that are helping to kind of grow the movement and help them learn from each other. So although the UK was the sort of leading market in this space before, I think that's less the case now, and it's definitely growing in other parts of the world in really interesting ways. And there's real opportunities for media to pick that up and share what's happening.
Yeah, yes, indeed. It seems that there is a lot of stories. And Sylvia, I know that there was a chat question to you about the Polish companies that you rated in Echovadis, and you answered this question. And I can see that there's like you rated over 1,000 Polish companies. Probably there is more in the CEE region, and 51 was at risk, 29% okay, and 20% advanced. So I think the region and Poland can do better. Do you think the way that media are covering those companies' actions and looking at them in terms of sustainability issues may have can be actually a motivator also here over in the next few years?
Yes, I think it should be. I think on a global perspective, what we have seen in the media and press content and data we collect is that there is a good news and a bad news. The good news is that the content on sustainability issues is becoming much more mature, sophisticated, insightful, fact-based, very rich. But next to it, there is also plenty of content that is published that is really, fuzzy, that is really PR or disguised advertising, and there's a big noise here. So the interesting content has grown and has become more mature, but is encircled by a huge noise, and hence the need for real journalism to try to see through the noise, and then also the need of a good rating agency to try to give expert opinion. Now, when it comes to Eastern Europe, I think the main driver will be probably in the next few years what Hugh said, the regulatory pressure and the consequence of the big deal, the Green Deal. Who is a big deal? Because when you look at the corresponding taxonomy, the carbon tax, the due diligence, it's going to impact Eastern Europe companies. So I think that will be a big driver. I agree. Another big driver are the clients of those Eastern European companies. We see a lot of big brands in UK, in Germany, in France, who have suppliers in Poland, in Romania, and they push those companies to improve on sustainability. Otherwise, this will bring them some negative effects. So the number two driver is the clients, and I think indeed the media probably are not doing enough. The local media in Eastern Europe are not doing enough, and I think to be on the optimistic side, I'm sure it's going to improve and grow, because they're going to be motivated by what they see from the Green Deal, what the regulations coming up, and I think their readers will want, and the companies will want to know more about those regulations, and so they will have to bring their some content on it to explain to the local readers what it means for the companies, and therefore they will, I think naturally they will tend to give examples of companies are not yet maybe in compliance with those upcoming regulations. So I think it's going to improve. I think the trend it's quite clear, and it seems like also local opinions, especially in Poland, as you mentioned, is asking for this kind of evolution in the press. So I think all the planets are almost aligned in Eastern Europe to have a richer debate at the press level.
It's great, and thank you for sharing also your perspective on the topic. And last question to all of you from me, and do you have any tips for editors and journalists you would like to share from your experience about covering this kind of stories? Like short, last wrap-up questions. Arjun.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
I think,
maybe I will, sorry for the interruption, but maybe to this last question, I would just add a question that appeared in the chat from one of the participants, is if you have any suggestions for the media, I mean, how media can actually partner, what is the scope for the media to work in partnerships with non-commercial organizations or philanthropic organizations? So what is not being covered properly by the media outlets? So on one hand, the hints, the tips that you can share, but also when it comes to working with other partners like philanthropic organizations, how they should approach you so that you can work with them to help them promote also those topics. So two in one.
Maybe if I can give my answer, I think what we lack in our case, in the rating side, and what I see from the content we collect, is we lack investigative journalists. I think independent investigative journalists, we work with some of them, especially, I'll give you an example, in Malaysia, in the surgical glove industry, there were some major human rights issues last year because of COVID. They were under pressure to produce more gloves, but on the other hand, they were not necessarily working in good working conditions. And we are in contact with a good investigative journalist who knows what's happening, and this is a really great source of information. The problem is that the business model for those investigative journalists is very difficult. So I think there's a triangle to find between philanthropy, mainstream media, and independent investigative journalists to be able to find a way for those independent investigative journalists to write very interesting stories, and that they will publish through the media and maybe financed by the philanthropy, I don't know. But I think we need to try promoting more of this.
Yeah, I think Sylvain makes a really interesting point there. It's very difficult. I mean, there's kind of two routes into journalism really on this stuff. You know, either you have a business model that works for you yourself, which is very difficult. I mean, doing good journalism and constructing a business model around that journalism is extremely difficult. And anyone that thinks it's not hasn't done it. It's really hard work, but it is possible. And my own personal view is that I think journalists should be thinking a lot more about owning their own business model. It's a personal view. I'm not such a great fan of the philanthropic side of things. But that said, I think it is one of the models that actually can be very relevant here, and I'd like to see more philanthropic organizations coming in to tackle the big questions rather than sometimes the sort of smaller issues. But that's just a personal perspective. But I think you either have your own business model ready and you're very robust about what that business model is, what it does, what it represents, and how you make the balance between the journalism you do. It's very hard. Or you have some kind of philanthropic relationship. If you do one, you probably can't do the other. Otherwise, you'd go crazy because you just can't. You know, building relationships with philanthropic organizations or non-commercial organizations takes time. It's hard work. You know, it's a very different demand to building up a business model that works with your journalism. I think you probably need to be clear about what route you want to go down. Balancing both, I think, is quite hard, but you know, maybe I just haven't given it enough thought or had enough time to. But Anna, I think sounds like she's doing better work there, you know.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, we work on a small scale. We're sort of 7 people in the company, so it's maybe a bit more manageable. But we do sort of do both of those things. So we have our independent journalism that is funded by ourselves and by our reader subscriptions, and you know, we'll pursue the stories that we think are important. But we also work with the likes of EVPA and other organizations, as I mentioned earlier, on these kind of special content partnerships. and I mean, yeah, I'd love to see more funding for investigative journalism over a long period. There are organizations out there that do kind of one-off grants and things, and that's great, but I think those are usually so oversubscribed, and yeah, we need much more kind of long-term funding for that. But just maybe it's useful just to explain a little bit how the EVPA relationship works. I suppose all our partnerships, it could be something really small from, say, a couple of features that we do together, up to a year or 2 years or longer working together, and that could be a mix of events and event coverage and long features and interviews and podcasts and whatever. And we've been working with EVPA for the last couple of years, and it works really well. And I'm not just saying that because EVPA are here, but because we do genuinely, I think, have the same kind of goals in mind, and there's just a strong kind of understanding of like, we'll figure this out together, and there's a respect on the partner side, on EVPA's side, that our journalistic integrity matters, and we're not just going to publish something that they tell us to publish or that their members want to be published. We'll always have a discussion about whether this is valuable, what our journalists can add to the story. We'll dig a bit deeper. And for us, it's given us access to a range of people and stories that we wouldn't have come across ourselves with our kind of limited resources, and has helped kind of open up new kind of themes that we think are important for our readers to know about. So I do think it's possible to have this kind of partnership. Yeah, you have to get the balance between how much time you spend serving these partnerships and how much time you spend doing other work that is kind of entirely independent and entirely driven by your readers. But we think it's possible, and it seems to be working for us at the moment.
Well, thank you. I don't know, Marta, if you want to address any last questions. We have 3 minutes to go. When I hear at the end that we have to finish soon, that's the rule.
I think we could discuss the different angles of the stories for a pretty long time and probably whole afternoon. But for now, I really would like to big thanks for all our guests, and invite all our viewers and listeners who joined us today and who will join us in the future to just explore Responsible Investor, explore Pioneers Post, explore Echovadis work that it's brilliant, and I'm working and also from the consultant side with them, and I know the kind of job they are really doing. And thank you very much for joining us today. And now I will just pass Eva to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I'm delighted. I really learned a lot, and I made like 3 pages of notes from what you've been saying, because I think it is super important for our work as EVPA when it comes to market building, promoting those topics, social investment. I really like, Hugh, what you said. Social entrepreneurship should be all entrepreneurship, right? That's for me, that would be one of the highlights. And I think I kind of felt at the end that in a way we are preaching to convert it, because what happens at the webinars like that we probably among the audience today, we got a lot of people who probably share the same views as we are, and that's why I would even ask more, the people that were participating in this webinar to promote the recording, because I think the conversation was really inspirational. And I think for many of the journalists or people working with the media, you gave really a lot of good advices, but I think also huge challenges. I'm hopeful that we will get there, right? That our markets and our media outlets that are operating in Central Europe will be more interested in covering those topics, and there will be the pressure coming, right, as many of you mentioned, either from the regulatory institutions like EU or from the companies themselves, right, because they will be seeking also for the coverage, or I think eventually from consumers, right, from all of us, because we really want to work and live and consume and use products that are produced by sustainable businesses as well. So thank you very much. I will be happy to invite you to more of our events as speakers, because I think those topics that you covered, actually, it's not only about journalists, but even more. So thank you again. All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks.